In a distant childhood, her father had promised his daughter, whom he called his favorite apple pie, to make her the first lady of the country. But now she, Reinhardt Rink, growing up on the estate of the Marquis of Rinke, sat over a coffin. The coffin of her father who had passed away 15 years ago. Before the girl realized what was going on, a painfully familiar voice sounded behind her. The Crown Prince, Michel Alankis, towered over her and was displeased with his wife's behavior, a wife with whom he was going to dissolve his marriage very soon, stripping her of her status as Crown Princess. Reinhardt knew what he was about to say. Michel wanted a divorce, and in response, the girl herself would be outraged. Should the Crown Prince speak such words before the coffin of her father, who died in his place because of the order? The father, the Marquis of Rink, kept his word then. He had given his daughter the most important title in the Alankis Empire through a marriage of convenience. Thanks to him, after an engagement at the age of 12, Reinhardt became a crown princess and called the wife of Michel Alanks. Of course, as is usually the case in marriages of convenience, between her and her husband there were no feelings. And the crown prince quickly found himself a mistress, Dulcinea Canaria, princess of the Principality of Canaria, taken hostage. She had the nerve to whisper orders favorable to the crown prince, such as stopping the importation of Sarawak desert salt in favor of the girl's home principality, and Michel was letting her do it. The crown prince, firmly in love with Dulcinea, began an absurd tyranny and reaped the fruits of his deeds. Sarawak, dissatisfied with the monopoly contract, mutinied. His Majesty the Emperor's orders were that His Highness the Crown Prince should deal with it personally. Michel then summoned the Marquis of Rink, on whom he hoped to entrust the duty of leading an army to suppress the mutiny in his stead. His wife's father was a retired general, and though he was willing to do the Crown Prince's bidding, he had a condition. For the Marquis to lead the army into battle, he demanded to put an end to the relationship with the Princess of Canaria. So, having gone to war for his daughter's welfare, the old general returned a cold body in a coffin. And now the Crown Prince, responsible for the death of his wife's father, was pondering how much compensation Reinhardt Rink deserved for her parents' valor. In the end, he reasoned that 1,000,000 Alankers in the lands of Helk would suffice. The lands of Helk were the most fertile territory in the empire, vast holdings with endless possibilities, and as the deposed Princess Reinhardt should be grateful for such rich and fertile lands. However, that was not what she desired. Much more, Reinhardt would settle for a life. The life of the Princess of Canaria, for the life of the Princess of Canaria, for the life of her father, who by and large had died because of this person's demand. Therefore, Reinhardt's anger would be dispelled if the Crown Prince would at least chop off her hand. The Crown Princess was not going to just accept this situation. Naturally, the Crown Prince started to refuse and called such an act cruel. Well, Reinhardt will be satisfied with Michael Alanki's head. She would be satisfied if she chopped it off and gave it to the dogs. Shocked by such a bold statement, the Crown Prince forcefully pushed his wife away from him, calling her crazy. The Crown Prince was going to get out of the estate, and in the near future he planned to send from the imperial palace of the official confirmation of the dissolution of the marriage. A sleeping wife he did not consider worthy of a choice in the matter. Reinhardt remembered how for 15 years she had been dying in Helka, the land of opportunity. The girl had begged countless times for a chance to go back in time, to give her just one chance to kill Michel Alankis. Time after time she had prayed and dared. And right now, that chance was at arm's length. The manor was filled with the scream of pain of the prince, who had been stabbed through the calf by his consort's sword. He howled, calling for the cardinal, and Reinhardt drew her sword for the next blow. She decided to finally put her good name aside improperly. Go crazy. Yes, Reinhardt Rinke had traveled back in time into her grieving self of 15 years ago, who would be abandoned by Michel on this day. 2 months later, Reinhardt Delphine Rinke was on trial for attempted murder of the Crown Prince. She was stripped of her title as Crown Princess, and the Rank family forfeited all their rights. Also, The lands, property, and servants of the Marquis of Rinky went into the possession of Michelle Alankes. The condemned girl herself was not upset. She had only recently realized that she had actually gone back 15 years to her downcast self and done what she wished. Wiped Michael's foot to powder. Now the crown prince would definitely not be able to practice his favorite dances. So at the trial, instead of sadness on the face of the former crown princess, shone a sincere smile. Seeing this, Michelle wanted to demand her father to punish her right now, but the emperor besieged his son. Because of the situation with Princess Canaria, the trust of the imperial family had already been shaken, and on top of that, the whole country was grieving after the death of Marquis Rank, and this oaf was about to announce a divorce. The crown prince should be thankful that he stayed in his place. Reinhardt Rinke was banished to Ruden of the Fielden family, the only land the girl had left. They wanted her to die of cold. Ruden belonged to Reinhardt's mother. It was a desolate and miserable place, very different from the Helk lands she'd gotten in her previous life. And it snowed there 6 months of the year. If that's not Reinhardt's wish to die in the streets, what is? The court, meanwhile, required the criminal to express her gratitude to His Majesty the Emperor until death, and to repent of her crime by being born again, and being born again, and being born again, and dying again, until the dragon soared over the Frame mountain range. In that moment, the girl resolved to survive to the very end in the lands to which she had been banished, and curse Alankes. Reinhardt had to travel to Ruden's lands on her own. She did so in the company of a mercenary hired by Johanna, who was the crown princess's maid. Rink had thought that he had somehow easily agreed to go with her despite the long journey, and her suspicions were justified. 2/3 of the way down the road, the man became stubborn, and the former crown princess made the decision to let him go on his own. However, the bastard demanded to give up everything she had, especially the sword on the girl's belt. It was the sword of the Rinke family, and it was unacceptable to give it to such a rabble, but the mercenary threatened swift retribution. Reinhardt gritted her teeth, but realized that survival was paramount. Did she have the right to waste her father's hard-earned life? So the girl threw all her money and sword on the snow and told the mercenary to get away. But the man grabbed her by the shoulder. All the savings and the expensive sword were not enough for him. He also wanted the body of the former crown princess, but Reinhardt spat in his face and ordered him to disappear. The man became enraged, slapped the girl and started pulling her hair, saying that she was nothing. He was going to take her by force, but before that he was going to torture her, causing physical injuries. But then the mercenary suddenly fell to his knees, grunting pitifully and covering his head with his hands. He was in pain, but why? What did it matter, though? This was Rinke's only chance to eliminate the threat, whatever it was. She brought her sword over the man and thrust it into his body. When the mercenary fell silent, the girl realized she had succeeded. She leaned back tiredly. Her gaze fell on the bloody fruit that had apparently hit the man in the back of the head, causing him to fall. A rustling sound came from the direction of the bushes. Someone was hiding there. Reinhardt held her sword out in front of her and demanded the man hiding there to come out. And when her order was followed, she was surprised. There was a boy standing by the bushes. Out of the bushes came a small, disheveled child, whom Reinhardt had mistaken for a demonic beast a few seconds ago. It bothered her to find a small boy in this wilderness. The worst reason came to mind: the barbarians living on the northern ridge. Her father had once told the girl that they lured people with small children and used them for food during the winter. Reinhardt decided to see if the child would attack her and held her sword out in front of her, threatening to slaughter him if he came any closer. The boy suddenly perked up and rushed towards her, despite the girl's warning shouts. Eventually, Reinhardt swung her sword and the child caught it with his hand by the blade. Blood flowed, but the child didn't even move. He pressed down on the blade, forcibly lowering it, and reached for the girl's hand. Reinhardt already thought that she was going to be eaten, but the boy began to lick the woman's fingers, or rather the wound between them. She had appeared when Rink had aimed her sword at the mercenary in a hurry and killed him. The girl hadn't even noticed, and the child had done it all to heal the wound. Then Reinhardt asked him if he had thrown the fruit that had smashed the man's head. The child shook his head. "Hey, hadn't meant to hurt the girl, and she was genuinely grateful for the help. But the boy didn't react in any way, prompting the thought that he didn't understand speech. So it was best to heal his wound on his arm first. Reinhardt pulled the now blood-stained bandages from under the corpse and cursed. The mercenary was a nuisance even after death. The boy suddenly responded to the curse with a jerky sound. When Reinhardt had killed the mercenary, she had swore too. Does this child really think swearing is a proper name? Rink reached out to ruffle her little savior's hair, but he recoiled and covered himself with his arms as if preparing for a blow. It looked like he had been abused while growing up, and now he was trembling and mumbling a weak no. Poor thing. Reinhardt calmed him down by telling him she wouldn't hit him, thanked him again, and stroked his head after all. Rink bandaged the boy's arm after all, and while he looked at the bandages, she looked at the map, trying to determine the direction Rudin was in. The blood-stained map wasn't very clear, but it was something. When the girl had already picked a direction, the child ran out in front of her with an emphatic, "No!" Rinky suppressed the suspicion in herself that the little savior could still lead her to the barbarians. She decided to believe and listen. When asked which way to go, the boy mumbled no incessantly, and then rushed forward with the same exclamation. Reinhardt followed him. In this way, they walked for about 2 hours and reached a place from which Rudin was perfectly visible. The way was much shorter than if they had followed the map. How did the boy know the way? In any case, it was deep night, so Reinhardt found a suitable cave where they could wait until tomorrow. It was snowing after all, and going down the mountain with nothing to see ahead was a bad idea. In the cave, Rinky built a fire with flint stones. The boy was mesmerized by the fire, and when he was given the stones, he enthusiastically began trying to make sparks. When asked if he was having fun, he again answered no. This was the answer the child gave to all questions, and apparently it was the only one he knew how to pronounce. Reinhardt thought that if she were to take the boy to Rudin, she would have to teach him to talk first. Where did the child come from in those mountains? And what was he doing there? When they reached the fortress, the boy suddenly threw a tantrum and tried to run away. That was how much he disliked the settlements. Reinhardt, even though she didn't know what the child was doing, realized that he didn't have a normal guardian. She had to think of a way to calm the little companion down. Rinka saw a man coming out of the fortress gate with bread. Reinhardt bought a couple of loaves and looked at the boy. He looked at the food with all his eyes and drooled at the mere sight of it. The girl gave him all the 2 loaves and watched the boy eating them with a smile. She explained that if the boy went with her to the fortress, she would give him more bread. He made the right choice and took the girl by the hand. Together, they went to the guardhouse, where Reinhardt introduced herself as Lord Rudena. She was taken to an audience with Sarah, the woman who had long been in charge of Rudena's administration of the field and family. It was the first time in 20 years that a Lord, Reinhardt, had come to this fortress in person. Jeopardy! Helka and Rudin were very different. Lord Helka's castle was 10 times the size of the one in Rudin, but Lord Rudin's castle looks like it's 300 years old. In addition, it snows 6 months of the year, and there's a constant shortage of food. There are only 30 soldiers to defend the vast lands as well. Although there were no wars with other lands, who would invade such a territory? Reinhardt never dreamed that the lands of the Fielden family, her mother's family, would be in such a state. Rinky asked Sarah for the working records of her cousin, the previous lord. However, it turned out that the previous lord was born and raised in the large city of Belkane, so he did his work through a deputy. While he was alive, he had only visited Rudin 3 times. In other words, Sarah didn't want some lord who wasn't local to get involved. But Reinhardt couldn't do that. Michelle, the bastard, was still alive. And his former consort hadn't started her revenge for real yet. Rinky directly stated that, for Sarah, the crown princess, who was probably kicked out of the capital for committing a crime, was probably too troublesome a lord. Sarah evasively remarked that she didn't say that. And since she had, Reinhardt had asked for advice on how to manage these lands. She was going to revitalize Rudin. So the first thing Rinky asked was to take care of the boy that saved her and to tell her if anyone found out about the child's origins. But as soon as the maid tried to take the boy away to wash, he broke free and ran away. The servants rushed in pursuit. Reinhardt laughed, finding the sight amusing. But soon the smile faded from the new Lord Ruden's face. Sarah reported that the local butler recognized the child immediately. He came from the family of Holland, who had fallen because of the barbarian attack. Rinka was clearly shocked. Holona. Could it really be Michael Alanquez's mad dog Will Holona? Will Holona, a man who once appeared and became the hero of Alanki's war. It was known that he was blood related to the barbarians, but Reinhardt knew his true origins. He wasn't just some half-breed barbarian. He was the Emperor's bastard. 17 years ago, while the Emperor was traveling to inspect the northern lands, a lady of the Holland family, a small aristocratic family from the north, got pregnant. The Empress, who found out, had a hand in the child's disappearance. She ordered that the entire Holland clan be burned and that no one be left alive. The Holland clan, falsely accused of treason, was destroyed. Animals, children, even women in labor were no exception. Everyone thought Will Holona was dead. But the year Michel Alanx turned 34, the year it had been 10 years since his divorce from Reinhardt, Michel brought him in. He fought like he'd die if he didn't kill someone. He won on every battlefield. He took over vast territories for his master and earned the nickname Mad Dog due to his incredible loyalty. All these accomplishments became the property of his master, Michel, and the insufferable crown prince, Michel Alanquez, was enthroned as the beloved emperor. Every time the subjects raged and shouted the crown prince's name, it was to Will Holland's credit. Will Holona, that cursed man. Reinhardt had been sure then that she would succeed in the rebellion, exactly until she met Will Holona, who had come to the Helklands, where war was being prepared. It was as if he had been expecting it. And despite Reinhardt possessing Helk's vast army and a river of wealth pouring down, she wasn't sure she could stand up to the man. Vilju Halone. Now, however, a smaller version of this man sat in front of her, apparently. Reinhardt had to wash and dry the child herself, because he would not let anyone but her do it. The servants were dismissed by the Lord as unnecessary. When they left, Rink looked again at the now clean and very cute baby. Holland's villa. Involuntarily, her palms clenched into fists, and she grinned wickedly. But immediately she changed her tone to a friendly one and offered the boy something to eat. He rushed toward the dining hall with a joyous cry of bread. As he ran away, Reinhardt covered her face with her palms. If that child is really Will Holona, if Will Holona is on her side this time, she might actually succeed in getting revenge. The thought made Rinxie's eyes brim with tears of happiness. Had her father really given his daughter a new life to give Will Holland in it? There was a knock at the door, and the girl hurriedly wiped away her tears. A boy looked out from behind the door. He brought her bread and put it in her hands. Reinhardt was still trying to realize that in this life, Will Holona would be at her side, would grow up obeying the deposed crown princess, would become her knight. And this time, there was no way Michel Alanquez would ever get her hands on this child, to whom Reinhardt Reinke had now given the name Wilhelm. Wilhelm continued to let no one near him but Reinhardt, who was now braiding his hair and marveling that this child was 16 years old. And while she was doing that, she was discussing Thanksgiving with Sarah. Food and goods were distributed to the villagers, for winter was merciless in Ruden. If the Lord didn't distribute food, the villagers would starve to death. Salt, flour, dried beans. Flour was especially expensive, and Reinhardt came up with the idea that they could grow corn on the land and make flour from it and then distribute it. Sarah agreed that the idea could be a success, but there were simply not enough hands in Rudine to do the work. There is a very small population in this land, and if you counted all the young men here, you wouldn't have 100. They may have had a fat turkey in the capital on Thanksgiving, but it's impossible to find one in Ruden. Wild goose at most, which the captain of the garrison hunted, and no one will come to the dinner party. Reinhardt, having heard all this, let Sarah go. She was convinced that Ruden was disgustingly poor land. They were too different from the Helka lands that Renke had gotten in her previous life. There were 3,000 soldiers. Every year they changed hundreds of carpets and blades. And here, for example, here this year, the guards were given 1 sack of dried apples as a reward. Reinhardt couldn't help but swear. Wilhelm immediately turned his head, responding. The girl hurriedly explained that she was not addressing him now. Renke had intended not to swear in front of the boy, but sometimes it came out of her own mouth with the current situation. She apologized for her behavior, and Wilhelm blushed like a poppy, muttering a quiet no. Reinhardt decided to check his homework, but on the sheet was written cornmeal. Soldiers, turkey. The words from her conversation with Sarah. Renke even laughed, suggesting that the pupil become her secretary. Wilhelm, on the other hand, rested on the girl's lap with his cheeks turning pink. He blushed even more when she patted him on the head again. It was incredibly hard to find a teacher for the boy in Ruden, mostly due to the fact that there are generally few qualified people in these lands, but also because rumors like this started to spread. The new lord went mad after losing her father. As a result, she was banished for attacking the crown prince. So Reinhardt will have to teach Wilhelm herself. Fortunately, he is a smart child, but unfortunately, the girl could not teach him everything on her own. For example, Rudena didn't have a decent swordsmanship teacher, and Rink wasn't a warrior. At the same time, in his previous life, Michel had quickly found him a teacher. He knew that Wilhelm was the emperor's bastard. Since Reinhardt herself had gotten this information from the crown prince's crony, it was accurate. But how did Michel know about Wilhelm's origins to take it upon himself to raise him? If even the inconsiderate crown prince realized, then the method should be simple. For example, the ring on the boy's index finger could have belonged to the imperial family. Rinka was pulled out of her musings by Wilhelm, who had finished his task. The girl praised him and habitually reached out to stroke his shaggy head. But the boy suddenly approached her and literally rubbed his forehead against her lips. Then flushed, he ran out of the room, leaving Reinhardt confused. When she realized what had happened, she laughed uproariously. On Thanksgiving morning, Knight Dietrich arrived in Ruden and got down on one knee before the former crown princess. He apologized for learning too late about what had happened, but as soon as he heard that His Highness had left the capital alone, he immediately went to Ruden. Reinhardt could not hold back her tears. She was grateful simply for Dietrich just coming here. But the man shook his head. Still, he could not do otherwise, for he and the girl were on intimate terms. Dietrich had the imprudence to say this in the presence of Wilhelm, who stared gloomily at the stranger with evident hostility. Dietrich Ernst is the childhood friend with whom Reinhardt used to have fun before, and one of the knights her father trusted the most. For a while he had even been Lady Rank's fleeting first love. Now he appeared in Ruden to the deposed crown princess and shared his impressions of this cold and depleted land as if nothing had happened. He even joked that when he passed the last mountain, he had wandered in search of His Highness for fear of finding her covered in snow. Reinhardt, who had briefly sent Wilhelm out of the room, asked him not to call her Your Highness anymore, since she was deprived of that title. Dietrich then decided to address her as Viscountess. The conversation about Ruden's unenviable state continued, and the girl sprang out of her own mouth about the times when she had ruled Helka. Dietrich could not know about that, of course, so Rinke quickly corrected herself, referring to a simple caveat. Then the knight inquired about the Viscountess's plans for the future and regretted that the crown prince had lost her. This surprised Reinhardt. If Dietrich had shown up a year ago, she would have thought he had simply come to inquire about the well-being of an old acquaintance. But Dietrich had arrived 3 or 4 months after the crown princess had been deposed. He came to meet her, who had arrived in Ruden only recently, now that the crown prince has not yet recovered from the shock of being wounded, and all the lords of the empire are closing in on the emperor to please him. That Dietrich came alone to Ruden at a time like this. He was either cast out of the family or he left on his own. Reinhardt put the question squarely. The knight evasively answered that if anything to choose, it was the second. The girl understood it this way. Dietrich had so often said he would leave the family and his older brother had taken to kicking him out. The man, chuckling, agreed. But after a moment, the smile slipped from his lips, and he shared his worries about Michael Alankes. He was trying to take full possession of Rinky's lands. Since the Viscountess had just been declared an outlaw, the Crown Prince began to greedily try to seize all of the Marquis of Rink's property. And not only lands, but also knights, because above all, the main wealth of Rinky was his knights. Dietrich simply could not watch as a man who could not even walk properly ruled the knights. Therefore, the knight blushed with an understatement. He had come to swear allegiance to the Viscountess. Reinhardt laughed that in Ruden Knights in Ruden as a gift for New Year's Eve, give Badian, and she simply had nothing to give him. And what would someone like Dietrich do in these lands? Rudena even has only 30 soldiers. Ernst said with an important look that he would have to become the leader in that case. Reinhardt looked at his back thoughtfully. Is he obligated to rot here, however? There might be one worthy occupation for him. The girl thought of Wilhelm. Dietrich would be a perfect match for his swordsmanship teacher. Rinky voiced this suggestion to Dietrich and took her to show him Wilhelm again. The man joked that he should get more than 1 sack of wheat for the role of teacher, but Reinhardt could only add a wild goose dinner on top. Chuckling, they headed for the dining hall, where they found Wilhelm. The boy clearly didn't like the sight of Reinhardt being led under the arm by Dietrich, and he was scowling and sullen. Reinhardt introduced Wilhelm as the child who had saved her life and invited Dietrich to sit down at the table next to him. But when the man tried to say hello to the boy, he suddenly jumped up and ran out of the room. He glared at the knight with a frown, peering out from behind the door. Reinhardt tried to persuade Wilhelm to return to the table, but he would not listen to her. Dietrich offered to bring the boy, but the girl decided to act in her own way. She began to eat very enthusiastically, saying that the food is very tasty. Rinky thought it was easier to interest a fractious child. Dietrich was not too sure about such a method, but still played along with the Viscountess. Seeing the knight pouring sauce over the food while helping Reinhardt, Wilhelm fled to his room, leaving the adults confused. Dietrich again offered to bring the boy back, but the girl refused. She thought that even if Wilhelm starved for a couple of days, it would clear his mind, and they should continue the meal now. After all, this could be their last dinner party of the year. It had been 3 days since Wilhelm had crammed himself into his room and never left it, not even for meals. Reinhardt didn't understand why the boy was acting this way, and it made her very angry. She even turned to Dietrich, asking what exactly could be threatened at such an age, so that the teenager would finally get the bad ideas of hunger strike out of his head. The knight inquired about the child's age, and when he found out that Wilhelm was 16, he swore hard, for which he was immediately reprimanded by his mistress. Dietrich was simply amazed. Wilhelm was 16, and it wasn't even he was frail and puny, as Reinhardt thought. Knights who look like a languid horse aren't 1 or 2 either. The man simply thought it absurd that a man who does more primitive things than a newly born foal was already 16 years old. When Dietrich himself had turned that age, he had gone to war, following the Marquis of Rank, and had served him. He was his escort, and this one. The Viscountess seemed to think that since Wilhelm was the size of a kitten, he was a small child to be cuddled and coddled. But that was not the case. Dietrich asked to leave it to him and, throwing aside the blanket, grabbed Wilhelm by the ankle. The man yanked his body upward with surprising ease and began to reprimand the teenager. Would this kid, behaving like this, be able to become a man to match the name Reinhardt had given him? The knight threw him off the bed and, ignoring the Viscountess's indignation, continued. He unexpectedly stated that, already at the age of 18, Reinhardt had proposed marriage to him. Embarrassed by such words, the girl tried to silence him, and while they fiddled, Wilhelm sat down on the bed. Dietrich had expected this. He realized from the boy's actions that he could work with his head, but even though Wilhelm looked like a child, Boys of 16 are crafty. The knight pressed the sore point, asking the teenager if he would continue to hide and just watch Reinhardt like this, even at 18. Wilhelm's gaze began to seem angry, and the firm no he had uttered now clearly made sense. When they were very young, Reinhardt climbed up a tree to pick apricots for jam. Suddenly she stumbled and flew down, but Dietrich caught her. Yes, there was a time. Now the knight was dragging Wilhelm away by the scruff of his neck. Behind them was Reinhardt, who did not understand, in her humble opinion, the outrageous actions of her friend. But Dietrich asked not to interfere, for, as he said, men have their own way of communicating with each other. The girl, however, continued to be indignant. Is it possible to grab a small child like that? The knight turned around and asked her ingratiatingly whether in that case he should go back to Ernst. Since you can't do that, Reinhardt couldn't find an answer. Wilhelm needed this training. She had no right to deprive him of it. So the girl apologized to the teenager and, kissing his forehead, promised that Dietrich would be a good teacher. Wilhelm only needs to obey the knight and become a terrific person. This clearly had a very strong effect on the boy, and he, blushing, became quiet. But Dietrich suddenly pulled him back and jokingly remarked that the kiss was not deserved, and it was better for the Viscountess to appreciate the teacher instead of the student. Reinhardt parried that the knight was already a terrific man, and such a compliment the man was satisfied. The Viscountess, staunchly bitching at Dietrich's frivolity, chastised him for treating Wilhelm well. The knight smiled and kissed her hand in agreement, much to the teenager's dismay. Wilhelm's frowning face made Dietrich laugh, and taking the boy under his arm, he headed away. Reinhardt escorted him with a perplexed look. Outside, Dietrich tossed Wilhelm onto the damp ground. The expression on the elder's face lost all friendliness. He didn't like children who couldn't think straight, and the Viscountess might have kissed a child like Wilhelm, but the man wouldn't. In the past, the sub-leader Reinhardt Dietrich had done nothing but chase bastards like this teenager off the land every day. Wilhelm's eyes showed that he understood the speech. The boy had saved the Viscountess's life without even knowing how to speak. In Dietrich's opinion, Wilhelm should consider it an honor that someone like him was able to save her life, and the knight would make him worthy of that honor because that is what the Viscountess desires. Dietrich tossed Wilhelm a wooden sword and ordered him to get up and move quickly. Quickly! The boy growled stubbornly and jumped to his feet, clutching the hilt in his hands. Dietrich continued to stare at him coldly. The knight had come to Ruden, hoping to persuade Reinhardt to leave these bloody cold lands in the Empire. But it seemed the day was far off when they would abandon the Empire. A few days later, a crowd of townsfolk marveled at how neatly Dietrich had cut the neck of a pig. People were clearly happy to socialize with him. Reinhardt could only marvel at Dietrich's ability to find common ground with those around him, and this despite the fact that people still avoided the Lord, who was here for 2 months. From the other end, the girl was timidly called out to Wilhelm by name, pronouncing the name in syllables. Rain. Hard. His hair at this point had already been sloppily trimmed by Dietrich. The sight caused Rinke to laugh heartily, and she beckoned the teenager closer to trim his hair. Dietrich was of the opinion that Wilhelm had to be beaten like a cornered mouse to make him human, for he could neither speak nor swing a sword, and this at the age of 16. Reinhardt, of course, thought that this was just an excuse for harsh treatment and was against it. But, surprisingly, the knight's methods were effective, and Wilhelm began to speak much more than when he was taught by the girl. And now Reinhardt was about to trim the boy's hair and asked him to sit still. It was the girl's first time cutting hair and, well, it showed. She cut it so short that Dietrich, who saw it, immediately burst out laughing and began to tease her pupil. The Viscountess gave the knight a stern look, and he calmed down, slapping Wilhelm's forehead. Dietrich was also distracted from the boy's torment by the food on the table, potatoes and corn porridge. It had been served more than once or twice, but at this time of year, even such food was a feast for Ruden. The knight reported William's need to eat more meat to get stronger. Reinhardt could not deny the reasonableness of those words. she concluded after a little thought, that it was possible to serve the boy the meat that had been left for her. Dietrich was adamantly opposed to this arrangement. The cold outside the window was fierce, and the girl needed proper nourishment and rest. When Reinhardt said that she was not cold, he advised her to take off her cloak and not to sulk at her old friend's words. Wilhelm, who had observed such familiarity in the Lord's direction, frowned unhappily. Dietrich, as if nothing had happened, leaned back in his chair and voiced his intention to go on a winter hunt soon, and to take Wilhelm with him. Reinhardt was against it, still considering the boy a child. He could not, in her opinion, do something like hunting. Wilhelm himself was clearly taken aback by this statement. Even he didn't consider himself that small. And though Reinhardt was against the idea, she realized that in their situation, with not enough guards to even guard the castle, there was really no other way. All the Viscountess could do was ask Dietrich not to die by falling on the antlers of a reindeer. Toward evening, Wilhelm drilled his toothbrush with a thoughtful look. Dietrich had previously intimated to him that if he didn't brush his teeth, he would be ahead in the reindeer hunt tomorrow. The suddenly approaching Reinhardt acted more subtly. She shared her terrible aversion to brushing her teeth that she had experienced as a child. But her father had told her that if she did it badly, the prince would run away when he came to take the girl away. Then she did not yet know what she would do in the future with Michael's leg. Wilhelm distracted her from her thoughts by timidly asking if she didn't like that sort of thing either. Reinhardt smiled and said that she really disliked guys who didn't brush their teeth. The pupil immediately began brushing vigorously in her mouth. Dietrich had repeatedly told the Viscountess not to treat a 16-year-old boy like a 6-year-old, but Wilhelm looked so cute. The girl couldn't treat him like an adult. After Wilhelm had brushed his teeth, Reinhardt checked the quality of the brushing and praised the boy, who looked embarrassed and looked down. In the evening, Reinhardt told Wilhelm a legend while Dietrich was busy with his bow for the future hunt. The contents of the legend were as follows. Halsey, the goddess of vengeance, hated reindeer more than anything else in the world. Alutica, the god of tranquility and fertility. The god of tranquility and fertility thwarted her deeds with the help of the reindeer that drove Halsey's chariot. On the horns of these animals grew a world tree. The taste of the fruit of this tree was Halsey's favorite flavor, so she, even knowing that Alutica was hindering her, did not harm the reindeer. Each time she ate the fruit, Halsey fell asleep on their backs. It was only when Halsey fell asleep that the weather became calm. Alutica, taking her asleep on the back of her own reindeer throughout the continent, brought fertility and tranquility. That is why, when it suddenly gets warm in winter, everyone says Alutica put Halsey to sleep. But when the warm days pass, a blizzard of incredible force is sure to come because of Halsey's anger. Dietrich frowned. He had warned Reinhardt that this was not a fairy tale for children's ears. The girl did not quite understand why, for it was told by the father of his daughter. But apparently, Marquis Rank did not tell the whole tale for his daughter's peace of mind. Dietrich enlightened the Viscountess by telling the missing pieces of the story. After the bitter cold, spring always comes. And the reason for the appearance is that the goddess of spring, Anilak, was born from the belly of Halsey. Hence, what did Alutica and Halsey, who slept 21 nights, do to bear a child? Reinhardt, realizing, immediately flared up and untimely covered Wilhelm's ears. It was too late. Dietrich laughed merrily. When Wilhelm fell asleep in Reinhardt's lap, Dietrich finally asked the question that had been tormenting him. Did this boy remind her of her father? The knight had a very clear memory of Marquis Rink bringing a 4-year-old girl from the road. Dietrich had been 6 and was only the second son of a common vassal, but he had been treated by the Marquis as he had been treated by Reinhardt. Now the man understood why he did so. The Marquis was trying to pull people in the family to his side and at the same time make Dietrich a partner for the games of a peer. Therefore, Ernst could not help but know why the Viscountess holds this child's hand, kisses his forehead, tells stories while sitting by the fire. He knew where these actions originated. Dietrich asked her to forget, if she could, that she treasured Wilhelm and loved him. Reinhardt threw a glance in the direction of the sleeping boy, Wilhelm. That she was doting on this child and pretending to forget her father was true, but the girl couldn't forget the reason she had sheltered Wilhelmina. So to Dietrich, she answered directly. If she had only been able to forget it from hurting the crown prince's leg, she would have forgotten it long ago. Dietrich understood her and hummed. He praised Reinhardt for her shrewdness. Or was it luck for Wilhelm? The black venomous snake in the Viscountess's arms had broken at least 5 wooden swords in the past week. Reinhardt was taken aback, then laughed. The knight woke the child, intending to send him to his private room to sleep. The teenager called the man Dietrich, and he complained again about his mispronunciation. Reinhardt, realizing that Wilhelm had difficulty pronouncing their names, set a condition. If Wilhelm went hunting successfully, she would allow him to call her Rain. The next day, Dietrich and Wilhelm and 5 soldiers went hunting. Within a week, they had caught a huge reindeer. The reindeer's head was said to have been cut off by Wilhelm. In the winter of that year, heavy snowstorms raged a couple times, in addition to 10 residents losing their way and freezing to death. Everything was calm in Ruden. 2 months later, Reinhardt was thinking about the situation in the Northeast. She knew that in 3 years there would be a big fire there. Because the Northeast is cold and dry, there is always the danger of a mountain fire, but the scale of the Raylan mountain fire was different. It took over a year to put it out. The Northeast was almost completely destroyed. This was also the reason why Michael's father, the current emperor, had lost the trust of the people. The explanation for why the fire spread so far is one. Buried in the swampy soil of Raylan is a dirty coal called peat. Over the years, fallen leaves, mud, various boggy complications, mixed, hardened, and became an ignitable projectile. Be that as it may, no one had expected to find so much peat in Raylan soil, but the current Reinhardt knew. For starters, she needed to prevent a forest fire from starting. She could secure a solid capital if she sold the selected peat, but there was a small problem. Raylan's soil doesn't belong to the Reinhardt lands, and she needed to get the right to mine it. But how? The girl was pulled out of her thoughts by Wilhelm, who called her by the acronym RAIN. Dietrich told Wilhelm to meet Reinhardt while he had business at the stables. The boy looked away, but the Viscountess admonished him to look the other person in the eye when speaking. William was still uncomfortable with the dialogue. They had spent an entire season on these lands, but in other areas that time could be counted as 2. Reinhardt also instructed Wilhelm to address Dietrich with courtesy and deference, which caused the lad to look surprised and displeased. He clearly didn't want to follow it, even if the knight was already his mentor. Reinhardt hadn't talked to Dietrich face-to-face in a long time. He had spent the entire winter with the boy, and had not left the Platz at all, as he had to pay for all the deer carcasses he had eaten. Sometimes, on particularly frosty winter days, the girl called Wilhelm to her room, the warmest room in the castle. This angered Dietrich. A woman who had once been the crown prince's consort was dragging a boy to her room. Rumors of this could spread around, and no one would care that she was the deposed crown princess. And the man was right about that. Dietrich is very strict with Wilhelm. Reinhardt even thought that the knight takes the boy for a younger brother. Dietrich has no one but an older brother after all. The girl also noticed how Wilhelm had grown older. The scars on his neck and chin were gone. Reinhardt had no idea how much work Dietrich had done. Wilhelm's broad shoulders were pleasing to the eye, but it was his face that pleased them most. In the Viscountess's past life, on the day she had met Wilhelmina for the first and only time, the girl had seen that scar on his eyebrow in the same place. Could this boy not be Wilhelmina? Reinhardt withdrew her hand, afraid she was too close and had let herself get too close. But Wilhelm shook his head. He repeated the words Reinhardt herself had once told her to Dietrich. What's the big deal about being close to each other? The Viscountess, realizing this, took the boy's hand with a chuckle, making him wince even more. Suddenly, Wilhelm yanked her toward him and hugged her tightly. Now it was Reinhardt's turn to be embarrassed. because as a pity today she was wearing a dress that was too thin and she could feel absolutely everything. Wilhelm's body was burning and radiating heat. The boy was worried when he noticed the Viscountess's hesitation, but she waved him away and said that there was no one closer to her than Wilhelm. After that, they came together to Dietrich's stables. Then the man told Reinhardt the news of an order. It was a conscription from the capital. Reinhardt assumed that the order had come to a backwater like Ruden because he hated her. But Dietrich was also to some extent the reason. The total number of conscripts was 30, making up the entirety of Ruden's guard without a trace. And there should be only one officially recognized knight. The Alankesian Empire gave conscription orders to the lords of each province every winter. This was because starving tribes of barbarians would descend on the empire. In this case, the lords had a choice. Either send their soldiers or send money. Most choose to pay. It's more convenient and costs less. However, Ruden has no money at all. Originally, only 10 men were drafted from this depleted region. So this time, 3 times as many as usual are needed. Another knight is also needed. But in the spring, when the predators have cubs, they would come out to the houses and even attack people, so it was also necessary to ensure maximum safety. But if Ruden followed the decree without question, there would be no labor force left at all. Also, rumors of Dietrich's stay had spread throughout the area. When he left, a huge number of people came to his house. Dietrich was considered one of the most prominent knights of the empire, who had been with Marquis Renke on the battlefield more than once. So the rumors of him heading to Ruden was Michael's doing. He clearly wanted him dead on the way. They couldn't ask the neighboring domains for help either, for they caused the lords of the neighboring territories to fall under the hot hand as well. It was known because Dietrich had already asked Nathantine Manor to send half an army and 2 knights, but they only had 2 knights. Of them, one was the lord's second son, and the other died due to illness. So all Ruden had to do was clench his teeth. Reinhardt cursed loudly as she cursed Michael for wanting to cut off the heir to their manor. Only a knight from Ruden could be sent into battle in place of the son of Nathandine's owner. But of the official knights, there was only Ernst himself. However, he would not go in his place. Dietrich cast a thoughtful glance at the practicing Wilhelm. Reinhardt immediately protested, barely catching a glimpse of the man's intention. But the arguments were against her. A guy like Wilhelm could handle it. He had broken the blade of the chief of guards last week and was growing very fast, as he had already changed 3 sets of clothes. If all of Ruden's guards are called in, the villagers will revolt. Wilhelm was destined to become a knight, and Dietrich asked to be sent as a knight from Nathanden. The man was well aware of how much Reinhardt treasured this child, but to complete her revenge properly, she must hold something stronger than a knife in her hand. Dietrich's advice was not to dwell on one child and let nothing spoil her plans. Watching the darkened expression on Reinhardt's face, Dietrich thought bitterly that she still had the same inability to be cold-blooded. The knight was then skeptical of the rumors that the girl had stabbed the crown prince in the leg and ended up in the dungeon, since the named Reinhardt, who was given a name that was only given to the official heir of Renke, could not have committed such an act. Marquis Renke had secured his daughter a place as the noblest woman in this world and made sure she was protected by the entire empire. But because that protection was too strong, Reinhardt could not learn to be strong on her own. She hadn't changed at all. In any case, they had no other way to keep Ruden's guard. Reinhardt, on the other hand, was now looking very pensive and even sinister. If Wilhelm replaces 1 knight, then conscripting only 15 men is a lie. One must pay a lot to rent even 1 knight. Besides, if it is about saving the life of the Lord's second son, they would not give a few warriors but a piece of land in return. For example, the swampy land of Raylan. There are tons of peat deposits buried in that land. At least their price would at least be comparable. At that rate, Villa Holland could be lent to him. Dietrich grinned. There was a reason the Marquis had given this girl such a name. The knight went down on 1 knee, humbly saying that he would follow his mistress's order. While hunting reindeer, Dietrich and Wilhelm talked about the legend of Halsey and Alutica. They wondered if Halsey hated Alutica because he interfered with her work and tried to lull her to sleep. On the other hand, Alutica loved her, otherwise Anilak would not have been born. William asked the knight to tell what happened after the birth of the goddess of spring, and he heeded this request. Halsey, the goddess of vengeance, was a very busy woman. There was no end to the people who begged for vengeance. However, exactly from the moment the child was born, Halsey took care of Anilak for 100 days, and afterwards left the girl with Alutica. His castle was very far away, so the journey to that place took a full 100 days. She left Anilak, and without a moment's hesitation, she left the tower, because Halsey hated Alutica. But she loved Anilak, whom she carried under her heart to the point of madness. So every year the goddess willingly visited the castle to see her daughter. Of course, she did not even look at Alutica, because from the very beginning Halsey did not love this man, and she became a goddess of vengeance because of the man. Dietrich did not tell this, but Halsey gave birth to 2 more children by Alutica, because she was not the kind of adults who spoil everything. Here Wilhelm gave out an unexpected thought. When he said that Halsey, the woman who liked Alutica, looked at him like an intrusive gnat, he said that he would not care if he were him. At the time, Dietrich didn't know who the boy was thinking of since such thoughts came to his mind. But later the knight realized when Wilhelm had to cut the neck of a deer just to keep the Viscountess from going hungry. He undoubtedly always before, and even then too, had that look on his face when Reinhardt was around. Such a reckless boy, whose gaze was full of greed and malice, Dietrich could not allow to be near his mistress. It is bitter when people grow up like ducklings, who look only at their mother, for one must first become a man. And then came the perfect opportunity to share Wilhelm with mistress, a summons. From Nadentine came a deed to transfer ownership of the marshy soils to Raylan. Sarah was curious as to why the Lord was accepting these worthless lands. But now it must be a matter of providing provisions for the soldiers who would be sent out at dawn to be conscripted. In order to have enough money for provisions, Reinhardt gave the jewelry to her mother, despite Dietrich's protests. The Crown Prince had confiscated all of the Rinke family's possessions, and the necklace was the only thing Reinhardt had left. But thanks to him, everything should go smoothly. Sarah bowed and set off to find a merchant willing to buy the necklace. At that, the woman called Reinhardt mistress for the first time. With Dietrich glaring at her with a judgmental look, the girl sent her away to make preparations for the battle. All organizational matters were soon finished. All that remained was to talk to Wilhelm. Wilhelm hesitated at the entrance to the study, for he had not had time to wash and smelled of sweat. Reinhardt waved him away, saying that she had long since gotten used to the smell of night sweat. Her father had once stopped abruptly before embracing his daughter as well. Wilhelm, with an impenetrable face, asked if Dietrich was the reason she had gotten used to it. The girl agreed, thinking that Ernst smelled twice as bad as her father. Wilhelm was suddenly very close. He leaned over and enclosed Reinhardt in a hug. The teenager sincerely hated the fact that the Viscountess was used to Dietrich. With this, he once again showed his considerable sense of possessiveness. Strangely enough, at that moment, Reinhardt was worried about Wilhelm's future reaction when he heard that he would become a knight sent by the Nadentine estate. Whatever Wilhelmina was, now he was just a small child that faithfully follows Reinhardt, and she is sending him to certain death because of money. The girl felt like a terrible person. The first thing she did was to apologize to Wilhelm and explain the situation. Rudin barely had 30 guards, and if he goes as a knight, the number will be reduced by half. With that, the Lord would be able to protect the inhabitants from predators in the spring. She had no right to let him refuse, no matter how much she wanted to. Reinhardt is the mistress of these lands. She must protect the lives of its inhabitants. And so in return, the girl promised to pray every night for Wilhelm's well-being. At night, when the moonlight descends on the land, day after day, before going to bed, she will pray for him. Therefore, Reinhardt Rink held out her ancestral sword to Wilhelm and asked him to follow her to war for her sake. This sword his father didn't even have time to bear when he fell from his horse and died afterward. And since it was a very expensive item, Reinhardt hoped that Wilhelm would come back with it. Madame Rink was going to cripple the Crown Prince, not only his leg but his life as well. Crown Prince Michael Alankes must say goodbye to his miserable life with this blade. Therefore, Wilhelm is obliged to return with it. Seeing the seriousness and weight of Reinhardt's spoken words, Wilhelm promised to return. And lastly, he asked her for a handkerchief, as in the old books where ladies give them to knights going off to war. Without thinking, Reinhardt tore a piece of cloth from her robes and wrapped it around the hilt of her sword. She didn't have a handkerchief, but only a few weekend dresses, so even that little was expensive. Wilhelm was glad of that too. He smiled, blushing once again. 2 days later, Wilhelm and Dietrich, along with 15 sentries, set off north. At that point, it had been about 9 months since Reinhardt had stabbed Michel Alanx in the leg. Good news had come to Ruden Manor that this year's conscripted soldiers were returning. Given when the message had been written, they would arrive in 2 weeks at the most. In honor of that, Reinhardt even allowed Sarah to take the apple cider she had bought. She dismissed the steward's economy. For now, they didn't have to watch their expenses so carefully. Time passed like an arrow. It was the 3rd summer since Dietrich and Wilhelm had left the estate. Baron Nadentine had gladly given the marshlands to Raylan, and exactly 2 months later he regretted it. When he saw the peat dug out of the land spreading like hotcakes, he immediately sent a representative. Of course, Reinhardt had prepared a clear answer for this occasion. Ruins of the Cold Lands was the title of the book written by the first empress of the state, Amaryllis de Fapina Alanques. Although Reinhardt didn't know why she was in Rudena, but the book clearly stated the existence of peat in the marshlands. That last part was pretty weird. What can I say? In any case, thanks to the proceeds from the sale of peat, Ruden has definitely changed, and even the famously harsh winters had gotten a little warmer, so no one had died of cold in the last 2 years. As the rumors spread, many people from other territories had moved here and the number of vacant positions among the guards had decreased considerably. On top of that, Reinhardt made a gift to the manager Sarah as soon as the opportunity arose. By then, the attitude of the people of the manor towards their new lord had changed. They became more welcoming and friendly. Everything was going smoothly. There was one thing though. The war was still not over. Battles with barbarians usually started in spring and ended in the middle of summer, all because they had to harvest their lands in the summer. This time, however, the war dragged on for 2 years, and the reason for that was William. He killed the chief's son, which paid huge dividends for Nadanthine, but the enraged barbarians of the north left the harvest, which led to the continuation of the war. It was not such a desperate situation, however, and also because of Wilhelm. Because the boy, not even 20 years old, but fought the barbarians like a former commander, people began to call Mad Dog. Dietrich reported in his letter that the Margrave of Glensia had promised to pay Wilhelm for the transition to his subordination, but the boy flatly refused to change his master. The Margrave, of course, was upset. But if the daughter of the Marquis of Rink is his master, it is well worth it. Wilhelm was constantly on the battlefield, so it was not easy for him to contact Reinhardt. For the most part, it was Dietrich who reported everything. And in his last letter, he also wrote that except for his habit of behaving recklessly on the battlefield, Wilhelm had become an excellent knight. What's worse is exactly a knight, not a soldier, because he couldn't get along with the rest of the soldiers. To be honest, Dietrich thought this was his personal shame. He furthermore believed that it was because of Reinhardt, who overly coddled his first apprentice throughout his growing up. Ernst also assumed that they would soon put an end to the war. 6 of the 7 leaders of the barbarian tribes were already dead. Of course, the tribes had also been defeated. Now, for the sake of trapping the ringleader, they need to attack the northern zone. Keeping in touch with Reinhardt in such a position would be difficult. Dietrich also received a letter from his older brother. His wife had given birth to a child, and the knight asked for a vacation after the fighting was over to finally get a look at his niece's face. In addition to Dietrich's letter, the envelope contained a scrap of paper that read, "Day after day, looking at the sword, I think of you." It was not hard to guess who the message was from. Looking at it, Reinhardt couldn't hold back her tears. She missed Dietrich and Wilhelm madly. That same day in the late afternoon, the girl heard about the news from the battlefield. The first news had come. Of death, Reinhardt could not believe her ears. A messenger arrived and gave a brief account of what had happened. All the forces had been concentrated on the outer wall, but in a moment the situation had changed and the barbarian troops had attacked simultaneously from both sides. Reinforcements could not reach the outpost, which was guarded by Knight Dietrich. Having belatedly learned of this news, Knight Wilhelm quickly dispersed the barbarians nearby and rushed to her Ernst. However, the leader of the barbarian forces was present on the battlefield, and so the battle lasted longer than they had anticipated. When her Wilhelm cut off the chief's head with an axe, the sun in the east had already lit up the sky. Thus ended the Empire's war with the barbarians, and so ended the life of Dietrich, who fought bravely alone. Reinhardt desperately did not want to believe the messenger. A veil of bitter tears immediately covered her eyes. She had laughed so hard when she had read Dietrich's last letter in the morning, while he had died a week ago. She remembered with pain the lines where the knight had lambasted Reinhardt for spoiling Wilhelm, and the lines where he had asked for a leave of absence to go and see his newborn niece. And the Viscountess smiled so happily as she read it all, while Dietrich was already dead. Reinhardt's legs gave out with grief, and she fell to the floor, sobbing. Dietrich, the one who had shared a bed with her as a child, listening to her father's stories. A friend. In the end, Reinhardt was the only one from her memories who had survived, because of a man who had treated the life of another so carelessly. Because of herself, Dietrich was dead. The conscripted soldiers finally returned to Ruden. They embraced their friends and relatives whom they had left behind for 3 long years. But behind the rows of joyous soldiers, there were soldiers carrying a wooden coffin in mournful silence. Behind the coffin walked Wilhelm. Whispers rippled through the crowd. People hardly recognized in the night that beloved child of the lady. Now the mere sight of him made the common people tremble. And if that night was Wilhelm, then it was Mr. Ernst in the coffin. Wilhelm stopped and looked at Reinhardt, who had come out to meet the soldiers. Still as beautiful, but in a black mourning dress. Wilhelm stepped toward her, wanting to embrace her, but missed her. She pushed him away. The first thing Reinhardt rushed to the coffin, which did not contain Dietrich's body, because it could not even be found. Tears came to her eyes again. But Reinhardt could not allow herself to do so in the presence of soldiers who had just returned alive from brutal battles. Dietrich had died, and they had survived. For them, and they had survived. For them and their kin, today was a celebration. The Lord stood up and vigorously congratulated the end of the war. In honor of this, everyone was to be compensated according to their achievements. In addition, returning soldiers were entitled to farmland free of charge for a period of 10 years. Through choking tears, Reinhardt announced the banquet. Everyone was happy because this endless war was finally over. There were cheers from everywhere. Everyone was rejoicing, except for 2 people. A drenching downpour fell from the sky. 2 men stood in the cemetery, Reinhardt and a man. They were Dietrich's older brother, who had refused to accept a coffin that didn't even contain a corpse. It was impossible to find any of Dietrich's belongings to put inside. And since he died as a knight of Ruden, he would be buried in those lands accordingly. Dietrich had chosen Reinhardt, and that choice proved decisive. The man's cold tone was hitting the girl's still unhealed wounds. The Viscountess lay down tiredly on the bed. Post-war time preparations for the funeral. A visit from Dietrich's older brother Baden Ernst. For some reason, even the heir to the family Glencia himself came. He was completely out of his mind. After that day, Reinhardt was not even able to say hello to Wilhelm, a child who, through her fault, had been fighting bloody battles for 2.5 years in a place he was unfamiliar with. He shouldn't have done that. He needed to call Wilhelm and talk to him, but first, he needed to change his clothes. There was a knock on the bedroom door. Reinhardt thought it was Sarah, so she asked him to help her unbutton her dress. But it was Wilhelm who answered unexpectedly. Rank immediately pulled the dress back over her shoulders and sat down embarrassed. 3 years ago, Wilhelm could definitely be called a little boy. However, the man standing in front of Reinhardt now, though the girl doubted he could be called just a man, facing a predator in the thick of the forest. Was there any point in recognizing its gender? Wilhelm gustily hugged Reinhardt, and the girl, at first taken aback, apologized. It was said that Wilhelm had guarded Dietrich's empty coffin for 3 days. It must have been the first separation he'd ever had to endure. He had been through so much, and Reinhardt blamed herself for daring to treat him so carelessly and push him away. She shouldn't have done that. Wilhelm didn't need this apology. He only wanted to hear that Reinhardt was glad to have him back. Clasped gently to his broad chest, the Viscountess cried again. How could she compare a kind young man to a predator? She thought of it bitterly. She had made Wilhelm like that. The knight snuggled closer, asking her to keep talking. Wilhelm admitted that he longed madly for Reinhardt. Unbearably long nights on the battlefield. She was the only one he missed. Only her. The next day, the heir to the Glencia family, Fernand Glencia, tried to buy Wilhelm back from Reinhardt for 100,000 alenki. But the girl, in a dejected state, declared that the sum for such a transaction was very small, which surprised the man a lot. The heir of the Glencia family came from the places where the war with the barbarians broke out. Reinhardt wondered why he had stayed in Ruden when the funeral was over. Certainly the man had an ulterior motive. There were 2 ways to change a knight's affiliation. The first was, as it was now, one could offer the owner money and take it with him. The second was that the knight had the right to change the owner himself by means of a chevalier's oath. Most likely William rejected Fernand Glencia's offer, and that's why he came to Reinhardt. And she too will undoubtedly refuse. Officially, the Viscountess argued that 100,000 alenki was not the most reasonable price for a knight less than 20 years old who had beheaded the leader of a nation of barbarians. But the man was ready to increase the amount, and 5 times. Nevertheless, Reinhardt flatly refused even to rent, not that to sell for good. In the heat of the moment, Fernand said that such a knight as Wilhelm has nothing to do in Rudana, where there are only 42 soldiers and no one to command. The man even promised to pay Wilhelm an additional 5,000 alenka every month. He also promised to give him his sister. Reinhardt was shocked by this. Did the Margrave of Glencia really consider Wilhelm as his son-in-law? But Rink's worries were in vain. Her knight was interested in nothing but herself. The heir to the Glencius family, panting with anger, left Ruden with nothing. Reinhardt and Wilhelm stared back at the departing men. It was incomprehensible to the Viscountess how a man as intemperate as Fernand could command men on the battlefield. However, according to Wilhelm, the man was quite popular. Reinhardt furtively glanced at the profile of her interlocutor. He looked like a completely different person compared to last night. Suddenly, Reinhardt wondered if Wilhelm himself was popular with the girls since he was so handsome. This drove the knight into a blush. The girl tried to talk about some small things like his bangs growing out, but Wilhelm took her hand and admitted that he had fought, thinking only of Reinhardt's words. Be sure to come back repeated wordlessly in his thoughts. And he had come back, and would always return in the future. So Wilhelm asked Reinhardt for a reward he could not yet tell her about. Fernand Glencia and his adjutant, Alzen Stugel, were sitting in a campfire by the fire. They were discussing Wilhelm, or rather how crazy he was. Fernand recalled that when Wilhelm arrived with the severed head of the chieftain's son, everyone was delighted and only the Margrave of Glencia sighed heavily. The northern barbarians came to the lands of Glencius every spring. It didn't do much harm to either side. The barbarians were a group of beggars who had been protesting for about a month for food transfers. If you gave them 1 or 2 food stores, they disappeared without a trace, and the soldiers didn't fight much. Instead, in the name of war, Glencia could command thousands of soldiers. It was an equal exchange. It was like that, but William cut off the chief's son's head instead of taking him alive. The knight, a mere boy, explained his deliberate murder by the fact that the enemy had touched his sword and insulted him. Fenwick recognized the sword as the weapon of the Marquis of Rinky. The man had heard that the deposed queen had been banished from the capital and had come to the castle of Rudin, and that the boy, the knight, borrowed from Rudin. Fenwick did not think that there was such a madman in his master's service. In short, the heir to the Glencia family had no idea what to do next. Bring a portrait of his younger sister. Also useless. Suddenly, a clatter of hooves was heard. A man who turned out to be Wilhelm was approaching them on horseback. On the battlefield, people often change. If you see a man being hacked to pieces a few times, the understanding of normal becomes distorted. In the camp, while still fighting, Wilhelm heard rumors that the crown prince had remarried. In the capital, flowers and bread were distributed for 3 days. There was terrible turmoil, and someone had been fighting in the land of Glencius for months. The soldiers also talked about how beautiful the new crown princess was. They had no doubts about her beauty, for as they laughingly noted, she had thrown out the last crown princess. Now they were discussing Reinhardt, defaming her name with taunts about how good she would be in bed, for she was no longer a virgin. Suddenly, the loudest of the soldiers was pierced through by a sword. The sword belonged to Wilhelm, who had killed the man in cold blood. There was a second of confusion, after which the soldiers became indignant and demanded an explanation from the knight. But Wilhelm moved forward and massacred the men, slashing their throats as if they were sworn enemies rather than allies. Dietrich barely managed to drag his furious pupil away from the soldiers. Wilhelm pushed his mentor away. A sword gleamed in the blow. Wilhelm, standing amidst a mountain of corpses, declared that the knight had been sentenced to death for insulting the imperial family. In short, this man, now arriving at their camp, was originally a madman. The war had also changed him for the worse. The adjutant watched the conversation between the two men with tension. Fenwick's face was rapidly changing to one of absolute amazement and even confusion. When Wilhelm finished speaking, the man gustily turned around and told the adjutant that they should return to Galicia as soon as possible. Jumping into their saddles, they galloped away. Wilhelm escorted them with an unreadable look. In the morning, Reinhardt found bread by her bedside. She assumed who exactly had brought it to the Viscountess's room. Wilhelm. He had done that as a child, too. The girl thought about the fact that instead of fighting, the knight should be taught etiquette in dealing with girls. Saying this, she unconsciously addressed Dietrich, but she hesitated half a word. She remembered. He was gone. Michel Alankes had taken another man. Reinhardt blamed herself, for she should have wounded the crown prince properly then. If she could go back again. Suddenly, it turned out that Wilhelm was in the room all this time, who had not managed to leave before the Viscountess woke up. He kissed her hand, terribly embarrassing her. Wilhelm asked her if she liked the lands, and when he heard an affirmative answer, he promised to give her a gift. Hearing an affirmative answer to his question about the lands, Wilhelm promised to give the girl this. At that moment, Reinhardt did not pay much attention to these words. She thought it was natural for a child to treat her parent in such a way, and thought his words were a joke. But Wilhelm suddenly invited her to go for a walk. In this innocent proposal, the girl also did not see a trick and naturally agreed. They were interrupted by Marka, who burst in, looking excited about what was going on outside. Reinhardt immediately went after her. As she stepped into the castle courtyard, the girl froze, eyes wide in surprise. Before her stood frequent rows of knights in full ammunition. Reinhardt, who had not recovered from her first impressions, was stunned even more by Wilhelm, who said that he had returned the land because his lord liked the land. That evening, when William caught up with Furnish Glencius and his adjutant, he offered them a deal. He wanted to be given Glencia's army. After all, the northern barbarians were gone, and the Margrave of Glencia was probably now contemplating what he should do with the 10,000-man army he had assembled under the pretense of barbarians. If the Marquis of Rinky were alive, the imperial family, through a marriage contract with him, could use force to restrain Glencia. But the Marquis is dead and his soldiers have dispersed. And at this moment, the imperial family will try any way they can to weaken Glencia. It's good if it ends up with just an order to disband the soldiers. William thought it more appropriate to attack the empire first and become the independent state of Glencia. The adjutant, upon barely hearing this statement, immediately shushed Fernac in an attempt to shield him from such rebellious sentiments. The latter, however, pulled him back by the shoulder, earnestly inquiring of Wilhelm whether this was what Sir Ernst had taught him. But Wilhelm shook his head. His mentor was a good man who never even had a thought of rebellion. He wanted to push through a proposal for negotiations and ask the emperor properly. Wilhelm himself, on the other hand, was going to engage Glencia's soldiers in a territorial war and return all the lands of the northeast to Ruden. Fernac nervously cried out that such a thing was ridiculous, and he had no reason to trust the knight and give him his soldiers to support him. To this, Wilhelm accused him of lacking the courage to act drastically. After all, if successful, Glencia would gain a strong friendly territory to ally with, the mistress of vast lands in the northeast. Fernac reprimanded himself. This did not sound like nonsense. Below Ruden was Orient, the richest land in the east. But unlike Marquis Rinke, who was favorable to the imperial family, Reinhardt was extremely hostile to it. If she becomes the mistress, and if Glencia helps her to do so. Fernac latched onto the last argument that the emperor would hold them back twice as much in such a case, but Wilhelm claimed that the restraints would be gone by then. Alzen tried to say that everything the knight said was utter nonsense. Fernac told the adjutant to stand back, and while Alzen was sitting by the fire, Wilhelm said something to Fernac that struck him even more. And after that, without a second's hesitation, the heir of Glencius and his adjutant set off. And now Wilhelm was smiling nonchalantly for Reinhardt. The girl, however, was not thrilled with this antics. Her concern was that they simply would not be able to maintain such a large number of soldiers. After all, this wasn't land. These were people. With an eerie calmness, Wilhelm threw a cloak over Reinhardt's shoulders, and the girl became truly frightened. Even though she had looked into his eyes countless times, his gaze at that moment was alien and eerie, as if Reinhardt was seeing Wilhelm for the first time. The knight at this time said, in an even voice, that the Lord didn't trust him as much as Dietrich. In his opinion, if the man who brought so many soldiers was Dietrich, then Reinhardt would surely shriek with joy. He honestly admitted that he didn't know everything that Reinhardt was sad about, nor did he know about her anger. But according to him, Michael Alankes had taken Dietrich away from them. Therefore, this hatred he shared with Reinhardt. And as the knight said all this and kissed her hand ceremoniously, while on one knee, Reinhardt became increasingly aware. Wilhelm now seemed an unbearable stranger to her. Reinhardt stood confused. All this time, she had seen Wilhelm only as an innocent child and thought that he did not understand what was happening. But as it turned out, that child had time to grow up, and she hadn't realized when. Wilhelm grew up feeding off her feelings. At his words, that he was only trying to return his lord's due, the girl pressed her lips together. She reminded him that she had never asked for anything to be returned to her. And even if she was going to do that, she should have been doing it on her own. Suddenly, Wilhelm said that Reinhardt was going to do it with his help anyway, that she was going to use her apprentice as a tool anyway. And then, whatever he did would be the result of the effort Reinhardt had put into raising him, and that included her anger. Wilhelm was going to be the thunder and lightning of Hurricane Reinhardt. A hurricane has a path, and thunder and lightning only follow it, having no will. And Wilhelm would clear Reinhardt's path, hoping that the road he would pave would be to her liking. The summer Ruden declared territorial war. Everyone scoffed, saying that the deposed princess had finally lost her mind. All because Reinhardt had put a 20-year-old commoner in charge. When Nadantine surrendered himself, everyone laughed at his master. But when the spacious and wealthy Delmariel lost to Ruden, no one laughed anymore. The Alankes Empire didn't interfere in the relations of territories unless the matter affected the taxes collected by the imperial family. Furthermore, the speed of the territory's conquest was unprecedented for these unexpected events to be noticed by the imperial family. Thus, the war ended in the winter of that year and brought 6 new territories to Rudin. The galvanized soldiers went on the offensive to the east. At one point, the army, numbering 1,000 soldiers, doubled in size. In an instant, a rumor spread that this was the work of Margrave Glensius. Famous feudal lords voiced their disapproval, but it was too late. From the east, Orient, Delmaril, and Fala, all who dominated the surrounding territories as powerful feuds knelt. The Knight of Rudin soon changed his nickname from Mad Dog of Rudin to Thunder of Rudin, and the territories that gave up the most taxes in the empire became the land of Reinhardt. At the meeting, the clearly bored crown prince proposed to simply rescind the order to disband the army given to the Margrave of Glensius and have him control the territory of Rudin. However, the emperor lambasted his son. Half of Rudin's soldiers are backed by the Margrave of Glensia. This means that if he summons them, these men will return and be loyal to him. It's highly likely that Margrave Glensia and the deposed princess are in on it. But Michael thought that was why it was better to withdraw the order to disband Glensia's soldiers, because then Reinhardt would lose his army, and the imperial family would be able to interfere with Glensia and Rudin's relationship. The emperor clenched his fists in anger, calling his son an idiot. If he let the Margrave gather as many soldiers as he wanted, there was no guarantee that he would return the soldiers sent to Rudin and not gather new ones to build up the force. The emperor leaned on his arm and lamented to himself that his only son was such a moron. He didn't notice people's abilities, had no insight into politics. If the prince had been personally involved in the campaign to suppress the Sarawak rebellion from the beginning, none of this would have happened. According to the imperial physician, Michel became cranky after he was shot in the leg, uninterested in business and only thinks of his own well-being. However, this is the Alanki's empire, the country that the prince will have to rule. The emperor was distracted from his sorrowful thoughts by one of those present. He reported that Rudin had achieved numerous victories through the acquisition of an outstanding knight. This knight had been trained by the second son of the Ernst family, but he had not actually received an official appointment. This man was not originally a knight and entered the war using a false identity. Normally, one wouldn't be charged for such a thing because they would die before being charged, but this was a crime. Based on that, they could invite the knight to the capital, and then he would personally pay for the crime. A letter arrived from the imperial palace, inviting him to the capital for a private audience with the emperor. In return, the imperial family guaranteed 2 things: the restoration of Marquis Reink's title and the return of his father's body. After Reinhardt had crippled Michel, the Reinke family had suffered significant damage. Title, ranks, and possessions were confiscated. The knights came under the control of the imperial family, and her father's body had to be buried in a public cemetery outside the capital. The girl could not refuse these conditions. She was finally one step closer to Michael, and unlike in the past, now that the girl was being kicked out of Rudin, she was ordered to go through the Crystal Gate. Crystal Gates. They were created from crystals containing mana, and were a transportation device that allowed for quick travel from gate to gate. It was said that once upon a time, a very long time ago, magic existed on the continent, but those times had passed, and magic naturally fell into decline. The founder of the Alankesian Empire, Amaryllis Alankes, being the last mage on the continent, created Crystal Gates. Becoming a new mode of transportation, they brought prosperity to the continent, and the Alankes family was able to firmly establish themselves as the ruling family of the empire. Because unless you are related to the Alankes, you need a resonance crystal to pass through the gate. And now Count Molly was actively arguing with Reinhardt, demanding to disarm her men, as passing through the gate with weapons was considered unacceptable. The girl objected. She had already passed through the Crystal Gates as crown princess, and passing through them, they would not only go straight to the imperial palace, but also meet the 20 knights who guarded the place. And of course, passing through the gate was an order from the majestic emperor, so they would follow it. However, if the order is so complicated, Reinhardt would rather get to the capital on horseback. After all, it was the imperial family that needed urgency, not her. The Count would not back down, now pressing the point that Wilhelm could not in any case appear in the capital without permission with a sword exceeding 1 reilus. His argument was that there were no exceptions to this rule, not even for the crown prince. But Reinhardt stiffly cut off that this sword was left to her by her late father, and even knowing the significance of returning to the capital, she could not take the sword away from her knight. In the end, the Count, gritting his teeth, retreated after all. As the man disappeared into another hall, Wilhelm thanked Reinhardt for protecting his weapon. The girl answered nothing, only asking Sarah to take care of the domain in his absence. There wasn't a man who didn't like the fact that the number of controlled territories had increased, but in about 6 months, Ruden had grown to such a size that it became difficult for the average person to handle. Wilhelm fought over the territories without realizing the scale, and Reinhardt and Sarah had to deal with what was left after the victories. The system of government was still unstable, and the Lord of the Lands had to leave, so Reinhardt tried to promise to return as soon as possible, but Sarah asked her to finish all her business and return to her post quietly. When Sarah had said on their first meeting that she was glad to see Reinhardt, she wasn't lying. Had there been anyone in the world back then who would have been at ease with the former crown princess? But Sarah had never hated her mistress. So far, the girl had given Ruden a great deal. Now it was Ruden's turn to support her lord. No matter how long it took, Sarah asked to ride in peace. In return, Reinhardt should do her thing and return with honors. Reinhardt smiled warmly, genuinely grateful for those words. From the moment she was kicked out of the capital, she had never imagined that she would live such a life. The thought crept into her mind. Maybe her father had given her this chance so that his daughter would not give up. In that case, Reinhardt should not run away anymore. She turned to Wilhelm with the intention of telling him something before departing. That day, after the conversation at the fortress, Wilhelm had ceased to be familiar to Reinhardt. Once pressed against his shoulder, she had felt calm, but he was no longer the earnest child protected by her. The child whom the girl thought she understood nothing had pierced her heart. He had followed Reinhardt with his blind faith, but she didn't think she could repay him for it. It was shameful and hard. Winning one victory after another that everyone had heard of. Alenki's the war hero who knew no defeat. It was too hard for Reinhardt to do the job of the head of the lands he had dedicated to her, though the girl had not thought of such a thing. Yet in a place unknown to her, her revenge was going like butter, and she had to give Wilhelm an appropriate reward. But for such accomplishments, Reinhardt had no idea how to even repay for them. And now, before passing through the gate, there was something she wanted to tell him. After all, the fact that they were heading to the capital was like putting her head in the lion's mouth, and before shoving it in there, the girl should trust her knight completely. Reinhardt told Wilhelm that he would be able to pass through the gate, even without the crystal, because he was the son of the emperor. She couldn't tell him where she got this information from, but she asked him to trust her. While the girl was saying this, she pressed her forehead against his chest. It made her nervous that the knight was speechless. But when he raised his arm to embrace Reinhardt, she noticed that the cloth of her torn sleeve, which she had given as a farewell, was still wrapped around the hilt of her sword. Wilhelm stiffened and apologized for not returning this cloth to his mistress, as he had proved too greedy. But Reinhardt, on the contrary, was pleased that he treasured the gift. It assured her of something. No matter how Wilhelm grew and changed, the child from that day would not disappear. And Reinhardt recognized her plans, in which she was going to use Wilhelm as a tool. But she trusted him with her father's sword. No matter what happened in the capital, no matter what happened there. Even if the knight's heart changed and he left his mistress while he carried that sword, Reinhardt Reinke would trust him infinitely. And one day he must return to her. She was afraid of Wilhelm, but it was because of this fear that the girl would not repeat her past life. In this life, Wilhelm belonged to her. She ruffled his hair. and an embarrassed Wilhelm decided to share something with her as well. Leaning down to her ear, he revealed what he also knew about his origins, about being the Emperor's son. It turned out that Wilhelm also knew of his origins. Upon hearing this confession, Reinhardt's eyes widened in surprise, and she abruptly pulled away from the knight. The girl asked him since when did he know about it. Wilhelm tried to calm the overly agitated mistress by pulling her against him. He couldn't answer her question right now. It was very bad timing that the arriving Sir Alzen entered the hall, catching Reinhardt in the arms of her own knight. The girl hurriedly moved away from Wilhelm, who quietly told her that they would continue their unfinished conversation later. With that, he made Lord Ruden even more desperate, and he strode forward, ordering him to get his horse ready. This was how it all turned out in the end. Reinhardt kept wondering why Fernek Glencia had given them so many soldiers. It wasn't gratuitous. It was just Wilhelm himself, acting as collateral. He was using the blood of the imperial family that flowed within him. In that case, it would mean that the royal family was involved in Ruden's every move, and the imperial palace had no reason to worry. The reason why Michael was the emperor's only son was because of the empress. Due to her age, the imperial family couldn't have any more children, so the only crown prince was the dummy Michael. With the existence of another candidate for crown prince, the emperor would have nothing left but to welcome him with joy. Finally, they reached the Crystal Gate. The count entered first. Reinhardt froze in indecision. Wilhelm suddenly leaned toward her and reminded her that he still had not received the promised reward, for the knight had returned as she had asked. And from now on, Wilhelm promised to return alive every time. That was why he had demanded the reward. When asked by Reinhardt what exactly he should be given, Wilhelm asked to give himself. The moment the girl heard this, her head went blank, and Wilhelm continued to speak. What he had always wanted was always, in every moment, was Reinhardt. And when they came close to the Crystal Gate, Wilhelm confessed his love to the girl. In the bedroom in front of the crown prince sat his wife Dulcinea. Dulcinea came from a small country, the Duchy of Canaria. When the Alanki's empire took the girl as a hostage, she was only 12. And the last gift her homeland gave this child was a tasteless and odorless poison, which she had to chew if she became unbearable. Hostage to the empire, locked in a dilapidated palace, ignored in it even by the servants. That's how she spent 10 years. Falling in love with someone was simply impossible for her. Every time the crown prince's leg hurt, his wife, the Princess of Canaria, washed his leg. Today the prince was in a particularly foul mood because Reinhardt Rink was to appear at the palace. Michel hated her. He had hoped that on the way to Ruden this woman would be torn by bandits, or she would freeze to death. But she had survived, despite rumors that she had been stabbed in the stomach by some unknown vagrant. And now Reinhardt was also the head of the Great Lands. The prince didn't understand how she had the conscience to come to the capital. Michel was going to make her regret for the rest of her life and lay her ex-wife's proud head on the scaffold. Thinking about it, he remembered the gift for Dulcinea, which he immediately ordered to bring. It was an expensive piece of jewelry that he wanted her to wear at the reception in honor of the head of the lands. Although Dulcinea was not even invited, Michel was determined to attend with his wife. He wanted Dulcinea to show Reinhardt how splendidly she was reigning over the crown princess seat taken from her. And having lived her entire life as a shadow, Dulcinea knew exactly what answer to give. It is, of course, a succinct yes. A short time later, the imperial family, including Michael and his wife, gathered at the official meeting place. The prince ordered her not to look at the floor, but to look proudly forward. But when the emperor coughing ostentatiously nearby, Dulcinea once again ducked her head, ashamed. At last, the arrival of Lord Ruden and her knight was announced, but barely seeing his ex-wife, Michel froze in astonishment. Dulcinea couldn't find a place to be before meeting Reinhardt Rinke. The crown she had worn in the past, the luxurious jewelry that adorned her, now it was all worn by the Princess of Canaria, and Dulcinea just didn't know how to look into the eyes of the woman who had lost everything because of her. Michel stood by her side and gritted his teeth, muttering insults at Reinhardt. The head of Rune arrived at the imperial palace without a single piece of jewelry. Dulcinea seemed to look at Reinhardt with a look of dread, as if she was saying with her entire appearance, "Bring back my father's corpse and everything you took from me." This made the prince's wife shake involuntarily, causing Michael's anger, as he had told her not to be so depressed, especially in front of Reinhardt. The emperor was also in a pensive state. He had summoned Reinhardt under the pretext of congratulating her on becoming the great head of the lands. It should be an honorable thing. But even so, to come with such an appearance, she came in her father's mourning clothes. The count introduced Reinhardt as the Viscountess. The emperor also called her by her status as a Viscountess to belittle her, but the girl didn't react, so she came here to regain her status as Marquess of rank. But His Majesty did not intend to return her status from the beginning, however. Knight Reinhardt, Wilhelm raised his head in a bow, and the emperor couldn't believe his eyes. Interrupting the count, who started to speak, the ruler asked the knight how old he was. Wilhelm was 20 this year, and something in His Majesty's mind came together. He praised the knight for such impressive accomplishments at such a young age and asked his last name. Reinhardt explained that Wilhelm's mother had lost her family in a barbarian attack and died after barely giving birth to a child. But the emperor did not relent, now inquiring about Wilhelm's father, or at the very least a marriage certificate. Reinhardt said evasively that it was not something that should be discussed in the Amaralis Hall, because it could become a weakness of one family. After that, the emperor suddenly addressed the girl as Marquis Rinke and prophesied that the negotiations regarding the return of Marquis Rinke's territories should be quick and productive. He therefore summoned them an hour later to his garden at tea time. Prince Michael stood as if thunderstruck by his father's action and only stared in surprise at the emperor and the guests. His Majesty invited Reinhardt to a banquet in honor of the birth of the new great head of the lands in 2 days. The crown prince didn't understand what all this was supposed to mean. Neither did those present. The return of the territories. It's just a bait to restrain Reinhardt and execute the knight. And Michel was literally shaking with anger and resentment. He mentally screamed that he would definitely kill Reinhardt. At this time, the prince's wife blushed. She noticed that Wilhelm was looking at her and smiling. Reinhardt's eyes glittered feverishly. Inside herself, she was jubilant. They had finally met Michael Alankes. The girl noticed the cane in his hands. A limp then. Reinhardt hoped that the crown prince's life was like hell. Just like hell, just like hell. Just like his ex-wife's past life. Reinhardt had only come back for revenge against Michel. She was going to take from him the life he had lived until now. Reinhardt would make it clear to him what hell is like in real life. With these thoughts, the Lord left the hall. They were invited to tea at an hour where they had to please the emperor. The man would definitely remember that Wilhelm was his son. Reinhardt was accosted by Alzen, Fernach's adjutant. He had come for something, for there was payment for Rudin taking Glincia's soldier, and to prove the kinship between William and the emperor, the girl must show Alzen the crystal, but she must also show it to the emperor during the tea party. There were too many eyes on them right now. The girl had to do the right thing, so she told Alzen that the amaryllis would be blooming this season. Amaryllis was the name of the first empress, and it was the same flower that was painted on the coat of arms of the imperial family. The fact that the flower would bloom this season meant that Reinhardt would provide proof that would be more convincing than the crystal. Amaryllis crest. Reinhardt exhaled tiredly. Too many worrisome matters had fallen on her shoulders. Wilhelm leaned toward her slightly, advising her to rest in the room, prepared for the great head of the lands. Alzen, who had observed this scene, was unpleasantly surprised. It seemed the rumors that the head of Rudin was with the young knight might have been true. The adjutant already wanted to get the crystal and return home as soon as possible. Finally, Reinhardt sat down on the bed in her room. She looked at the disposable crystal in her hand. It shatters after you use it to go through the crystal gate. However, one crystal was still in Reinhardt's possession. Reliable proof that Wilhelm is a blood relative of the Alankes. With this crystal, Reinhardt would be able to gain the emperor's trust. Wilhelm offered himself as an escort at the tea party. as she might try to be attacked. Now is the best time for those who want to destroy Rudin, which was previously surrounded by power. If Reinhardt, the great head of the lands, were to die, the territory would also collapse naturally. They needed to be prepared for the Emperor to try to kill the girl, but there was little chance of that happening because Wilhelm seemed to like him. But even though it wasn't a bad thing for Reinhardt if Wilhelm became the crown prince, she still asked if the knight himself wanted to become the Emperor's son. To this, the knight suddenly admitted that he wasn't sure if he wished to be a prince. But that being said, Wilhelm would prefer to leave it up to Reinhardt. Right now, however, he just wanted the girl to kiss his forehead. Reinhardt blushed. She remembered that confession again, and her mind went blank. She didn't know how to react to that, so she escorted Wilhelm out the door, referring to her desire to sleep. She was really having a hard time with him now. Reinhardt and Wilhelm arrived at the tea party in the garden and greeted the Emperor courteously. The latter greeted them in return, once again addressing Reinhardt as Marquess. Reinhardt rightly reasoned that since the Emperor had called her Marquess, he had no intention of slitting her throat. At this time, the Emperor turned to Wilhelm and also invited him to sit down at the table. Reinhardt immediately became agitated because she forgot to tell the knight about the etiquette of the imperial palace. However, contrary to her fears, Wilhelm gave a perfect answer and continued to stand, as he was not supposed to sit next to respected aristocrats. The Emperor was clearly pleased. He got straight to the point, declaring the return of Reinhardt's rights to the Marquis of Reinhardt's rights to the Marquis' family, as well as lands and properties, except those given to Michael. This would include the return of the Marquis' body. But before that, the man wished to see the birth certificate of Mrs. Reinke's knighthood. Reinhardt was going to give it to him personally, so she stood up from the table. The knights near the Emperor became wary. They were wary of her, a woman who had stabbed the crown prince's leg. Surely they couldn't even imagine what she was capable of pulling off this time. Reinhardt held out her birth certificate. That document, of course, was a forgery. What was truly important was the crystal inside. No one would be able to interfere with the secret and genuine transaction. Through it, Reinhardt would build a special trust with the Emperor. By evening, Reinhardt collapsed tiredly onto her bed. She had gotten a lot of things done in this endless day, and it was still not ending. Wilhelm, meanwhile, ordered to prepare clothes for Reinhardt and him, as he was to be officially appointed knight at the banquet. The girl was surprised by this. She did not understand how Wilhelm knew about the appointment. Yes, and he had been observing etiquette at the tea party recently. This was definitely something that needed to be discussed, and Reinhardt ordered Mark to leave them alone. Wilhelm had asked if it would be all right for Reinhardt to be alone with a man late at night, because others might find it a reason to reproach her. But even before that, the others had always found reasons to reproach her, so she didn't think it was important. Besides, the others already thought that she and Wilhelm were in a relationship. The knight looked surprised. But Reinhardt didn't care what other people did as long as her own conscience was clear. She had raised Wilhelm since he couldn't speak, so to her he was more like a capricious child than a man. Wilhelm stiffened, ashamed, and Marka, chuckling, left the room. Reinhardt was about to speak about the worrying question when the knight suddenly gently pushed the girl on the bed, hovering over her, and seriously said that the child in his face had already grown up. Reinhardt pretended not to take the hint and apologized for joking about it in front of Marka, for she too had once been embarrassed every time her father called her an apple pie. But Wilhelm reminded her that the difference between them was only 8 years. However, the girl stubbornly refused to talk on the subject. Instead, she asked him how he knew about the blood ties. Suddenly, Wilhelm closed her mouth. With words to the effect that children didn't like overly nosy parents, the knight left the room. The girl followed his back with a glance. Reinhardt thought the reason for this crush was the fact that she was the only woman he knew. But Wilhelm was her only card, and she could not bind him to her with something so abstract. Love, in her opinion, is quite transient and fleeting. Wilhelm at this time was thinking with annoyance that he should not have confessed then. He was suddenly called out by a woman with a sword, beside whom Dulcinea stood and looked at the knight with a blush on her cheeks. Dulcinea recognized this knight who had arrived with the head of Rudin, while the lady gazed admiringly at him. Cilia demanded that the man observe etiquette, for before him was the crown prince's wife. William did indeed kneel and introduced himself, bowing in a bow. Cilia hurriedly chased him away, though the knight spoke in his defense that he had been put here, and then where could he go from here? The woman was clearly outraged by the stranger's insolent behavior, but Dulcinea hastened to reassure her that the knight might not know the intricacies of the palace, since he had arrived recently. William agreed, and the Princess of Canaria was mortified that such an insolent man would kneel before her. However, Cilia still resented the knight's behavior. Dulcinea told her to stop and then turned to William. This place was close to the palace where she lived, so this was also where the prince's wife walked. For the sake of His Majesty's precious guest, Dulcinea was ready to leave today, but from now on she asked him to leave this garden for her, as it was her only pleasure. At this, the girl's heart beat hard, and often from the excitement caused by the man, who finally raised his head, indicating that he understood her mistress's wishes. At this, Dulcinea and Cilia moved away. The prince's wife was so embarrassed that even her neck and back were blushing. When they had gone a few steps away, Dulcinea unclenched her fingers and threw her handkerchief on the grass. Wilhelm picked it up and looked at Dulcinea, who was blushing terribly. 2 days later, on the day of the banquet, the preparations were already over. The knights of Rudin had changed into their ceremonial clothes. Only Reinhardt was left to put on the prepared robes. But Lord Rudena refused to change her attire, and instead ordered Glencia's adjutant to be summoned. Alzen appeared with a broad smile on his face, but when he heard that their conversation would not involve Emeralis, he immediately looked sour. Reinhardt handed him a note with personal information about the man she was looking for. Since Alzen was not going to attend the banquet, the girl asked him to rest and find this person in the capital. The adjutant's face so-and-so demanded at least some explanation, but the man Reinhardt needed was just in the capital, and he should definitely be brought. In a past life, the man had been capable of single-handedly ruling Helka. Mrs. Sarah was of age and had no experience in managing a large territory. And this man was a skilled professional, which Reinhardt had asked Alzen to track down so that Rudin could strengthen himself. Alzen had nowhere to go, but he immediately warned that he would report everything to the Margrave of Glencia, since the adjutant was his subordinate after all. That was exactly what Reinhardt wanted. She wanted the Margrave to consider her competent. Even without Wilhelm, he must believe that Rudin is strong. By the way, Wilhelm had never shown his face to her since the day he left Reinhardt's room. But she decided to leave the knight alone as he would need time to get his thoughts in order. But if he changes his mind and leaves, even without him, Reinhardt must prepare herself so that the case will not fail, because this is her revenge. The girl regretted that at a time like this there was no one around whom she could safely confide. Involuntarily, she remembered Dietrich. What would he say? Reinhardt quietly said his name aloud, which could not help but hear Wilhelm standing behind the ajar door. At that moment, Wilhelm remembered many things about Dietrich. Their first meeting, his bravado about Reinhardt's sympathy, his courteousness toward Rain that made him jealous, and the way Reinhardt had first rushed not to Wilhelm's arms, but to Ernst's coffin. The knight gritted his teeth in anger. In the same mood, he walked into the room. When Reinhardt tried to find out the reason for his absence the previous 2 days, Wilhelm interrupted her, demanding to know why she was meeting with Fernex's adjutant. In that meeting, Marka and even the knights of the guard were escorted out of the room. In doing so, the head of Rudin was left without anyone's protection. But Reinhardt interrupted him with a sharp question about whether Wilhelm was her lord. The knight was taken aback, immediately apologizing. The girl, however, told him to close the door. She then asked him to tell her right away if Wilhelm wanted to become a prince. Then Reinhardt would gladly address him as Your Highness. except that the crown prince is no longer Mrs. Rinky's husband, and from the moment she addresses Wilhelm by title, he will no longer be able to become her family or anything else. The knight protested. After all, he wasn't doing all this to be called a prince. He ended up apologizing to Reinhardt. Wilhelm handed her a jewelry box for the banquet, but the girl thought this was not the right time to talk about jewelry. She decided to talk about something really important. Reinhardt assumed that Wilhelm was avoiding her because she had rejected his confession. However, she needed him for the sake of getting revenge on Michelle Alangse. She shared that she had spent a lot of time alone, implying her past life. And now Reinhardt admitted that she didn't trust Wilhelm. He'd been hiding his secret, but he told her he loved her. For the sake of winning her heart, behaved naughty. In the girl's opinion, the knight could not say that he cared for her by acting this way. Coming to the capital was not part of the plan. Reinhardt was gradually laying the foundation, was going to wait until Michelle ascended the throne, but because of Wilhelm, the plan was ruined. The knight, on the other hand, parried the fact that Reinhardt never thought of giving him her heart. No matter how hard he tried, she wouldn't give the place beside her, because Wilhelm was just a tool that couldn't do anything to her. To this, Reinhardt icily stated that Wilhelm didn't love her. He just wanted to get his hands on a toy he didn't have. To be fair, it wasn't that hard for Reinhardt to accept that love. She demonstrated it by pushing Wilhelm onto the bed, sitting on top of him, unbuttoning first the knight's shirt and then her own dress under Wilhelm's stunned and somewhat even frightened gaze. Like all these people around her said, Reinhardt could, if need be, intertwine their bodies with Wilhelm's every day. He was the only weapon she had left, and if Wilhelm wanted to get Reinhardt, he had better get her right now. In return, the girl would give him nothing but her body. Wilhelm couldn't get a word out. He was shaking with excitement and blushing desperately, looking at the half-naked Reinhardt, who was waiting for his decision. If the bread beast bared its fangs at its master, Reinhardt would only tighten the collar around its neck more. So she leaned toward Wilhelm, touching his cheek affectionately. The girl was giving him a choice. Either engage with her or leave things as they had been until now. Wilhelm was silent for a moment, then asked if Reinhardt could love him back when her debilitating revenge was over. At that, his palm moved up the girl's thigh. But then he sat up abruptly. Wilhelm began to adjust Reinhardt's clothes, saying that by pushing her away now, he would thereby give her a firm assurance of the truth of his love. He was willing to do anything to get Reinhardt completely, even if it was something that would push her away. The girl blushed slightly. This feeling that had arisen in her, though it was similar to what it had been when she had been caught by Dietrich as a child, or when she had been with her ex-husband, but it was completely different. New, it seems. They really can't go back in time. As Dulcinea was washing her husband's foot again, the prince's mother, Empress Castria, appeared in their bedroom. She pushed Dulcinea away, sitting down next to Michelle, and immediately asked how he was feeling. The woman had come because she had heard how her son was having a hard time right now because of Reinhardt Rinky's arrival. She convinced the prince not to worry too much about her, as he is the emperor's only seed. And no matter how these brutes flounder, Michelle would eventually become emperor. The empress wanted to slit their throats too, but she preferred to wait a bit and play around once they were in their hands. And for that, she asked her son to wait a little longer, because when he became emperor, he would be able to show these two hell. Suddenly, there was a quiet clinking of glass. The empress looked angrily at Dulcinea, who was cleaning up the shards, calling her useless out loud. The girl clutched her dress with her wounded palm. But no matter who was going through what horrible time, the time of reunion had come. Even those who mocked Reinhardt from afar struggled at the banquet to say hello to her. Thus began the knighting ceremony. When the empress saw Wilhelm kneeling, she felt a sense of déjà vu, as if she had seen this man somewhere before. But the emperor called the name of the new knight, Wilhelm Halona, and the woman fell into a stupor. She remembered how she had ordered the Holland family to be burned when she learned that an inferior noblewoman in the periphery had dared to conceive a child with the emperor.